I'm picking up somewhat the last couple of weeks, and it's almost impossible to have an exact closing point, because to try and close off one of these subjects regarding the lost tribes requires, and you've got to open 3 other doors. And I think what I'm trying to do is make sure that we understand, first of all, probably first and foremost, the sovereignty of God. Now, with his people, who he delivered out of Egypt's bondage, and gave them this wonderful promise before they even went in that they'd come out. Wouldn't you like that? Before you even go in, generations before you go in, the promise to come out generations later and better. Now, the beautiful thing is, if you're reading the whole book, where he says eventually he's going to scatter the people after the kingdoms divide, and we know that, I've told you, the north will disappear. Some will be carried away to another land. Others are going to just vanish, and they don't really vanish. They just begin to migrate. The southern kingdom will be taken into captivity, and essentially the kingdom as it was known will be gone until Cyrus issues the decree for the people to return and rebuild. And we know that in that period, very few people returned. And we have a very good history, by the way. From about that time, people say, well, there's nothing after the close of the Old Testament prophet Malachi, 400 years silence. No, there's plenty of things that we can glean in that period to understand what was going on. That brings us to essentially to the time of Christ, into the New Testament world. But the beautiful thing is that God, in his word, said, I'm going to scatter these people. And then give some word, not just to the prophet Hosea, but to others, including references that are made in the New Testament from Christ himself regarding sheep, the lost house of Israel. It's kind of interesting because sometimes we read and we don't read with, looking at the whole book and examining. So it's kind of interesting that if one is going to comb this record, we can see God said he was going to scatter a people, and he also said he was going to give them the promise of restoration, which is future time. Now there's many of those promises and many of those prophecies, future time, in Isaiah and in Ezekiel, just to name 2, as well as if you're reading the final chapters of the prophet Zechariah as well. We can pick from just about anywhere. Now, to somebody who's not well-versed in understanding the prophets, some of those things may appear as prophetically in the past and accomplished, but there has not been a restoration to bring back the house of Judah and the house of Israel, which have been separated, which the prophet Ezekiel refers to as 2 sisters, and kind of spells it out pretty graphically about what these 2 sisters represent. But he's speaking of the north and the south, by the way, and calling what they've done whoredoms. It's quite graphic, by the way. Anybody who says, well, how could you say that? Well, it's in the Bible. And by the way, that chapter is, as I said, quite graphic. So when we talk about the end of the house of Israel, which is referring to the northern kingdoms, the northern portion, it's somewhat interesting that in 2 Kings, which is where I'm going to take you this morning to start off, there is, beginning in the 17th chapter, and in a strange place to start, the 6th verse, but straight through the chapter, clear to the end of the chapter, the reasons for the fall and the carrying away of the people. This is why it's imperative to understand the difference between Israel and Judah. We're looking at the house of Israel, that's sometimes referred to as, going to be referred to here as Samaria. And if not properly understood and separated, creates the confusion where people are immediately saying Israel refers to Jews. Now, let me just say this so it's repeated in this message. The people of the southern kingdom, Judah, Yehuda. There is no J in Hebrew, but it is Yod, Yehuda, Yehudahi. These were, or the Yehudahites, the first ones to be called Jews. And they're referred to in the King James English as warring Jews. Reading the Hebrew, they are warring Yehudahites. But same thing, it came into our English that way. Not to be confused with those people to the north who, although there may have been some priests living to the north, because priests were assigned to the northern territories as well, in the northern areas, but for the most part not referred to at any time as Jews. And when we begin to see how this plays out, it's quite interesting. Historically, I'm going to read this text and I'm going to take you on a little brief historic journey. So we're in 2 Kings, the 17th chapter, and I'm starting in the 6th verse. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria took Samaria, carried Israel away into Assyria, and placed them in Hala and in Habor by the river Gozan, and in the city of the Medes. And I gave you that insight that the Septuagint reads, the Septuagint is the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible done 200 to 300 years BC, placing them perhaps in the mountains, in the mountainous area of the Medes. And if you want a little bit more elaboration as to who was carried away in this group, you've got another list of people taken to approximately the same area mentioned, and that is, I'll read it to you, where it says, the God of Israel stirred up the spirit of Pul, king of Assyria, and the spirit of Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and he carried them away, even the Reubenites, the Gadites, the half-tribe of Manasseh, brought them unto Hala, Habor, Hara, and unto the river Gozan, unto this day. So we have a good idea of who is mentioned as being carried away. Now I'm going to say this as a sidebar. I do not believe that everybody was carried away. I believe that the word of this impending force that was coming their way produced waves of these individuals settled in the northern territories beginning to migrate and beginning to move before the final period, which is I think in 721 by Sargon II. He finished the job that Shalmaneser didn't quite do because he died in the process. But it's important to note, and there's good evidence to prove, that there were several groups of people who began to migrate and others who were carried away. And this will become important, by the way, in understanding how, when these people are settled into a different land, and the reference right here, by the way, Hala, Habor, and the other reference I just read to you, which is Hara, the area around the river Gozan and the city or the mountains of the Medes, the Media area, is actually specifying two distinct areas that are apart from each other. And eventually two distinct, even though all these people begin to migrate, some of these people are carried away. The ones that are carried away are settled into two different areas, and there was a reason for that as well, because if they banded together as one, they could be a mighty fighting force, but separated and kept apart, in buffer states, they could provide protection for any marauding invaders, but also it would separate the risk of them banding together and turning against the Assyrian forces. So there's all these small details. Now, back to the book here. For so it was that the children of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God. Now you're getting the explanation of why, which had brought them up out of the land of Egypt, from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and had feared other gods and walked in the statutes of the heathen, whom the Lord cast out from before the children of Israel, and of the kings of Israel, which they had made. And the children of Israel did secretly those things that were not right against the Lord their God. And they built them high places in all their cities, from the tower of the watchman to the fenced city. And they set them up images and groves in every high hill and under every green tree. And there they burnt incense in all the high places as the heathen, whom the Lord carried away before them, and wrought wicked things to provoke the Lord to anger. Now, everything you're reading here is about them turning away from the living God, from the living God, and serving other gods. And think about this. It's the very thing that was pretty much the straw that broke the camel's back for God with Solomon, the wives turning his heart away so that he followed other gods. And if you think about it, people tend to say, well, back there, and the Pentateuch, God said, thou shalt have no other gods before me. I'm a jealous God. This is, if he's the God of deliverance and salvation and the God of eternity and the God of the forefront and the God who is at the end of things and the beginning of things, it would seem very plausible that we would take a chapter out of this, a page out of this, and say, of course, we wouldn't do such a thing. But to have a modern understanding of what is going on here, although these people, there's an itemization going on, but we do the same thing. We think, oh, these people, how terrible, look what they did. But we do the same thing. We set up idols in our life. We're not bowing down and worshiping to statues, but something that takes the place of God. Anything can take the place of God. And things that can be even seemingly good can take the place of God. The footnote here is not to just read the history of these people, but to understand that it's really a wake-up call to every single person who decides that there's something more important. As I said, it can be even something good. C.S. Lewis said, the difference between cuddling up in front of the fireplace with a good book versus reading the good book. Well, if it interferes with reading the good book, he was referring to the Bible, then that becomes an idol. If it interferes and takes the place of it, if it cuts into, it's an idol. We don't tend to think of things like that, but I bet you, and I'm speaking first, I never point the finger at you and say, hey, I bet you every single one of us has an idol in our life. In fact, I'm sure of it. Some of it good, some of it bad, some of it you're not even aware. That has taken the place of what should be front and center, and most importantly, not in compromise as these did. So, it appeared as worship, but this is a different type of thing going on here. It says, for they served, verse 12, they served idols, whereof the Lord had said unto them, ye shall not do this thing. Yet the Lord testified against Israel and against Judah, you see even here it's separate, by all the prophets and by all the seers, saying, turn ye from your evil ways, and keep my commandments and my statutes according to all the law which I commanded your fathers, and which I sent to you by my servants the prophets. Notwithstanding, they would not hear, but hardened their necks like to the neck of their fathers, and did not believe in the Lord their God. And they rejected his statutes and his covenant that he made with their fathers, and his testimonies which he testified against them. And they followed vanity and became vain, and went after the heathen that were round about them, concerning whom the Lord had charged them that they should not do like them. And they left all the commandments of the Lord their God, and made them molten images, even to calves, and made a grove, and worshipped all the host of heaven, and served Baal. And they caused their sons and their daughters to pass through the fire, and used divination and enchantments, and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, to provoke him to anger. Not enough to just stop serving, but let's just twist this completely the other way, provoke him to anger. Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel, and removed them out of his sight. There was none left but the tribe of Judah only. This is important for those people who keep thinking that this is one batch of people and not separate and distinct. Here you have it. When it says, but only the tribe of Judah, now, it's referring to that southern portion. Also, Judah kept not the commandments of the Lord their God, but walked in the statutes of Israel, which they made. And the Lord rejected all the seed of Israel and afflicted them and delivered them into the hand of spoilers until he had cast them out of his sight. I don't know why, when I read that just right there, it actually makes me have a little bit of a knot in my throat. That God would get to the point of saying, you must be cast out of my sight. That's how bad you are. For he rent Israel from the house of David. And they made known Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, king. And Jeroboam drave Israel from following the Lord and made them sin a great sin. For the children of Israel walked in all the sins of Jeroboam, which he did. They departed not from them, until the Lord removed Israel out of his sight. As he said by all his servants, the prophets, so was Israel carried away out of their own land to Assyria unto this day. And that pretty much, if somebody says, they're listening to me, particularly those people who don't have Bibles, who listen and they will argue and say, what are you talking about? Well, I just read it to you. It's right there. And we've got abundant, we'll call them historical breadcrumbs to back up what's being said here. Now, there was a first, we'll call it carrying away. I don't really want to use the word deportation because unlike the southern kingdom that will fall later, that actually were carried away into captivity and deported in the truest sense of the meaning, you've got at least 2 or 3 records, beginning for sure the one that is in secular records, 730, 732, and then 2 more after that that are recorded, that are absolutely, we can say, these are the dates, to about 722, 721 BC. And then what's important to note here is, and why I made the reference, that not all of the 10 tribes to the north could have been carried away. It's important that you hear this out because this will explain some other things I'm going to say later, which you may go, huh? They couldn't have all been carried away and settled in the areas that I mentioned. The area would not support it. If you imagine, even though we're talking about a large group of people spread out in the northern kingdom, where they would have been settled, the areas that are described as Hala, Habor, Hara, by the river Gozan, and in the cities or the mountains of the Medes, could not support the entire population of all the tribes. So just hang that there for a minute. Now, what's even more weird, and I find this is the weirdest part of this whole chapter, is what happens after the people are deported. This is the weird part. Beginning at verse 24 through verse 41, we're still in 2 Kings 17th chapter. And the king of Assyria brought men from Babylon and from Cutha and from Ava and from Hamath and from Sepharvaim and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the children of Israel. See, he brings in these people from all over the place, but not many, and I'll explain why in a minute, not many to live there. Very bizarre. And they possessed Samaria and dwelt in the cities thereof. And so it was at the beginning of their dwelling there that they had feared not the Lord. Therefore the Lord sent lions among them, which slew some of them. Lord, I'm praying for my lions. Right? But it's the weirdest thing I've ever read. The king of Assyria rounds up people from all these different places and has them live in Samaria, the very place that he's cleaned house from. The people didn't fear the Lord, so the Lord sent lions, and the lions killed some of them. Therefore they spake to the king of Assyria, saying, the nations which thou hast removed and placed in the cities of Samaria know not the manner of the God of the land. Therefore he has sent lions among them. So this is what's crazy. They even acknowledged. You might read right by this. They even acknowledged, they said the God of the land, but they acknowledged that it wasn't some random thing like because the city was barren. The lions came. They said the God of the land did this thing. And these are heathen people. That's what's so mind-boggling, is they acknowledge that. They at least acknowledge that, which is far more than some heathen people I talk to. Never mind. Therefore he hath sent lions among them, and behold, they slay them because they know not the manner of the God of the land. Then the king of Assyria commanded, saying, Carry thither one of the priests whom ye brought from thence, and let them go and dwell there, and let him teach them the manner of the God of the land. So now you're going to bring back a priest who was once dwelling there in all of its customs to teach these heathen people about the God of the land. Wait. Then one of the priests whom they'd carried away from Samaria came and dwelt in Bethel and taught them how they should fear the Lord. Howbeit every nation made gods of their own and put them in the houses of the high places which the Samaritans had made, every nation in their cities wherein they dwelt. And the men of Babylon made Succoth-Benoth, and the men of Cuth made Nergal, and the men of Hamath made Ashima, and the Avites made Nibhaz and Tartak, and the Sepharvites burnt their children in fire to Adrimelech and Animelech, the gods of Sepharvaim. Nice people. So they feared the Lord and made unto themselves of the lowest of them priests of the high places, which sacrificed for them in the houses of the high places. So it's like a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And if you have a little bit of this and a little bit of that, you should be okay, right? That has to be the logic there. They feared the Lord and served their own gods after the manner of the nations whom they carried away from thence. Unto this day they do after the former matters. They fear not the Lord, neither they do after their statutes or after their ordinances or after the law and commandment which the Lord commanded the children of Jacob, whom he named Israel. I like the fact that this chapter kind of spells out everything if you're still not sure who we're talking about. With whom the Lord hath made a covenant and charged them, saying, Ye shall not fear other gods, nor bow yourselves to them, nor serve them, nor sacrifice to them, but the Lord, who brought you out of the land of Egypt with great power and a stretched out arm, him shall ye fear, and him shall ye worship, and to him shall ye do sacrifice. And the statutes and the ordinances and the law and the commandment which he wrote for you, ye shall observe to do forevermore, and ye shall not fear other gods. And the covenant that I have made with you, ye shall not forget, neither shall ye serve other gods. But the Lord your God ye shall fear, and he shall deliver you out of the hand of all your enemies. Howbeit they did not hearken, but they did after their former manner. These nations fear the Lord, and serve their graven images, both their children and their children's children, as their fathers, so do they unto this day. And this closes a chapter in God's book about these people. Now, if you were combing the prophets, you would find that there will be prophets like Nahum who will give prophecies concerning Nineveh and the demise and the fall of Nineveh, or of the Assyrians. There'll be abundant witness that God is not only going to deal with his people, but he's also going to deal with these people. But in the process, it's very easy, and I've heard so many different strange arguments on, it's very easy to say, well, God did this thing, and this is an unjust act. No, he said very clearly and gave them chance after chance. And even after this, which appears to be the end for these people, it is not. So we're essentially watching what is happening now on the pages of history. And if an individual is willing to do the work, there are abundant witnesses to people who will appear in a different land as they move and are migrating essentially at the initial appearance, what looked to be north and then constantly west. You will find there is one particular incident that occurs that is recorded specifically in this way regarding a place on the map called Phrygia and its capital that was taken by a people who will be known as Cimmerian, not Sumerian, Cimmerian, C-I-M-M-E-R, I think I'm saying this by my mind, I-A-N-S, it might be something like that, you figure it out, but it's not Sumerian. Cimmerian, as the Greeks refer to them as the Chimmerioi, who will be later referred to by several different names as we begin to trace these people. But these particular people invade this land, Phrygia, which if you have a Bible, you can look in the back of your Bible and find and locate where Phrygia is. Pretty easy to do. If you take a look, right there. And what's interesting about this is most Bibles have a map somewhere. If you don't have one later on, look it up. But try and get the optics of this. If these people were coming from this land, where my index finger is, it's going to look good on radio, and they move across, remember I said scattered across the Euphrates, they move across the Euphrates, and they begin to move north, and they're moving across in this direction. Actually, some will move up towards Thrace, some will move towards Mysia and Phrygia. But there is a certain historical reference that chronicles the invasion of Phrygia by these people who, let's just say, disappear from one place and are moving, and we know they're moving in that direction because, as I read to you, 2nd Esdras out of the Apocryphal describes the direction, moving towards these mountains, Sereth, moving essentially north, and various migrations, not just one, that the invasion of Gordium, which is historically chronicled by a people fitting the description of the people who were formerly living in an area and had traveled a pathway. This is all kind of chronicled. So it's either that we have the strangest collision ever recorded of two different people. One group of people disappears over here and they reappear over here. It's like magic, and they're not the same. But then if they're not the same, what happened to these people? Who will, by the way, will be able to trace them and know that they're the same people. And we're able to do that through different historical methods. There are places where we have a record. Tiglath-Pileser I, that's way much earlier, refers to people he defeated near the Euphrates as the Muski. And some people have said, well, are these the same as the people you're referring to? These people who will be called the Sumerians, and sometimes a different group of people called the Scythians. Well, we're going to say they're all going to come from about the same woodpile. And there's going to be some intermingling along the way, but these became two separate groups. They'll be referred to historically and eventually by separate names, and the names will morph and change as they keep moving. So if we were going to take a timeline, the best way for me to do this would be to start with the 5th century, because by the 5th century, there are at least 5 major historians recording that people known as the Celts now, we've moved from the Sumerians, C, to what the Greek referred to as the Chimeroi, to people referred to as the Keltoi or the Galatai people, who will be referred to later as the Celts, who were dominant throughout Europe. And as you begin to trace the footsteps of these people, there are a few things that become obvious. Now, that's why I said you open one door and you have to almost deal with other things, because we haven't touched the tribe of Dan. From previously, I said you were going tribe by tribe and we were looking at the famous people and their issues and maybe some breadcrumbs that can give us some ideas of things. We haven't gotten to the tribe of Dan, which undoubtedly made many of these journeys before this time, because much of the land that these people, these Sumerians / and Scythians who begin to migrate, will cross over territories that have already received names that bear the mark of Dan. And when I say that, don't think English, don't think D-A-N, think D-N, because the Hebrew language does not have, unless you understand vowels were added later, it does not have any vowels, so we don't really know exactly what it would have sounded like, but you've got enough places that were named after the tribes as they went. the tribe of Dan specifically, leaving their names everywhere. Probably easier for me to show you a brief idea for those who are not familiar, who are going, what are you talking about? See, that's why I said it's kind of challenging to try and, for those people who don't have a frame of reference, who might be extremely confused by this. So this is going to be very dark, so you're almost going to move over here in a little bit more light. And if you can see the yellow, you've got the Dnieper, the Donets, the Don. These are all rivers that bear the name of the tribe of Dan. And then this map I'll explain a little later. It has to do with a Scythian culture that's dispersed and spread like seed all over the place. And all of these markings have to do with settlements and finds regarding the Scythians. But that's a different story. What I'm trying to say is that in migrating, this first subject that I'm dealing with is already crossing some of these territories that have already received names from a tribe that has already moved on long before this period ever started. We know that, by the way. I'm introducing something which I'll have to pick up somewhere else. We know that the tribe of Dan was on the move way back there in the book of Judges in the 5th chapter while Deborah is singing her song. She's asking why Dan did not come to the aid, why Dan was still in his ships. Their territory was on the seacoast, and by the way, they had already been traveling and migrating. That was already, we're talking a great time before these events that I'm discussing. So along the way, they have left and named places that will pick up in another message, going as far from the territory they left to Macedonia, Caledonia, Scotland, all of the different places where their names will pop up, and we will find the mark of the tribe of Dan has been dispersed pretty much everywhere where you can follow their trail and recognize this is why in the prophecy, the blessing prophecy given by their father Jacob, who became Israel, he says he's like a serpent, leaving a trail like a serpent winding all over. And the map pretty much records that. So as these people, we're talking about now, I'm mixing two groups of people, the Sumerian people and the Scythian people, begin to move and migrate. There's already been, we'll call them breadcrumbs, of other peoples who have migrated, who have named places after their own tribes and have moved on. By the time of Ashurbanipal, which is 668 to 627 BC, Sardis, the capital of Lydia, will fall. And it's taken several times by several different people. First by the Sumerians, then by the Traer, then by the Lycians. And it's finally, by the end of the 7th century, it is restored by the former king, who becomes king again, Alieres, who finally gets the Sumerians out of his territory. And why is that important? Because you begin to see a new migration. Now these people, I want to be able to read something to you, and hopefully I can figure out how to get permission to do this. But there is an incredible work by a man who I believe had to have spent most of his life researching the origin of the races. And the information that he provides on the human remains that have been unearthed, we're talking about primarily skeletal cranial remains that have been unearthed, to make some comparisons between the people we're talking about in, for example, my reference to the Sumerians versus the Scythians, versus, for example, people that will encounter the Thracians or the Traer. All of these people where cranial remains have been found, and he had done this study to analyze the different sizes of skull and some of the different finds that were incorporated. And there are certain things that he concluded as they began to find these remains, that people in certain parts, they were not separate people. Some of these were of the same group that branched off, and over the course of time, in the environment that they were in, there were some changes that occurred, and whether that was through intermarriage or whether that was through climate, however. But his research is remarkable. And part of that discovery, he goes back to talk about the finds at Hallstatt and Le Ten, and really actually reinvestigates and opens up what many people have considered closed at this point. The period referred to as the Le Ten period is that period from about the 5th, typically has been referred to from the 5th century to just before the 1st century, of these Celtic people moving. But in fact, it's now clear that it's actually earlier than that. And the finds at Hallstatt in Austria, the same thing. And of course, this map that I just showed you gives you a good idea that when you're looking at a map that gives you a pretty good idea of how scattered this type of culture, which if one is going to trace, will extend, and finds of these people will extend all the way to the southern parts of Russia, and with great archaeological finds and discoveries which have been matched up to some of the finds from Hallstatt and Le Ten, an incredible, I believe, 2,500 articles at least from that region. And you begin to see that these people bifurcated, and a lot of tribal concepts that we thought were actually unique to these people are moving across the country or across the planet, because even things as crazy it may seem as pants, trousers or pants, or cultural things, horse wagon type cultural elements that were not natural to these parts, were brought by these people. There's certain things that we can trace. So as we begin to trace these people in a historical way, not just the finds, but some of the history, we trace their march around the Black Sea. We find definitely at the outset, I should have said this, around Lake Van, Lake Urmia, around the Black Sea, over and around the Carpathian Mountains. So we begin to see these people moving. And as I said, 700 has been typically the timeline, BC. By 600, these people, or one group of these people referred to as the Keltoi, moving west. And we even have an ability to examine the philological, their linguistics. Although we don't have preserved records per se, there's a known philologist who has divided up the Keltoi into two groups, Q, which is what has survived into Ireland, Scotland, and the Isle of Man, and P, which are the dialects in Asia Minor to Wales. It's kind of interesting. There's two actually distinct studies on these people. So there's a lot of things that we can know, and we can follow the progress of these people. But probably the most important gotcha thing in all of this, which is something that it should be a fascinating thing for anybody who hasn't heard of it or hasn't examined it, which kind of clenches all of this together, because there still may be people saying, well, are these people that you've described originally as the House of Omri? I'm walking you back now through all of the steps we've gone through, the House of Omri, that was referred to first as the king who died, and then all the people that came after that followed him as, instead of the house of Israel, the house of Omri, Beit Humri, that then began to be referred to as the Gemera or the Gemir, the people from the land of Gemir, that began to be referred to as the Cimmerians. How do you make the connection that these people, or in many cases actually it's the Sakai, how do you make the connection and know that these are the same people? How do we know that these are the same people? Well, it is the Beostan rock. For anybody who's still sitting on the fence and saying, well, I don't know about this. Well, it's a timeless piece of a great example of how language can clarify things and not be a separating factor. Just think of the Behistun rock as just like we thought of the Rosetta Stone before Champollion cracked the code and figured out that there were actually three distinct languages, and that hieroglyphics were not, it wasn't just limited to pictures. We were looking at a language distinct. The Beeston rock was a tribute to Darius, the king, and it was a list of 23 of the nations that came under his rule. And it was carved in a rock, which is quite high. I think it's 4,000 feet up. It's on a precarious cliff. 3 columns of languages. And until Professor Rawlinson, who at the time started off as a 25-year-old Englishman off to that part of the world, and it became his life's work. He didn't start off as someone who was fascinated in this. He was assigned to a post, and that became his life's work, and other people then picked up after him. But it was in that work that these columns were deciphered. 3 languages: Babylonian or Akkadian, Elamite or Susian, and Persian. And what we found in these columns is that the people being referred to in the Persian and Elamite were the Saka. In the Babylonian, they were the Jamira or the Gamira. So when you talk about, well, how do we know who these people are? Are they one and the same? Obviously, these 3 columns were 3 languages saying the same thing in 3 different languages. And when you get to the Babylonian language, the people who are being referred to in the 2 others as Saka, which we referred to as those Sakasuni, the house of Isaac, are being called in the Babylonian Jamira or Gamira. They're the same people. They're just a bifurcation of each other, but they're the same people. Remember I said to you 2 settlements, probably where they bifurcated? 2 settlements. So it's important when we begin to look at the historical evidence that we pay close attention to these finds, because they help us to understand that as these people begin to move, there is a development and there will be warring factions. There's interesting studies, by the way, if you're interested, on the Carthaginians, which most people will argue against this, but we'll find that the Carthaginians, who actually paired up to fight against these people we're referring to, the Sumerians, the Simri, the Saka, actually are probably related to these people. In other words, down the road, there'll be people fighting and warring against each other who actually, somewhere back there, were actually part of the same tribe. And we can trace this by good evidence. It's not just some random idea. Anyone who's interested in reading some of the work by Herodotus that chronicles especially the Scythians, and I brought with me this particular book, which is right in front of me, so I might as well read a brief article, very brief, on the Scythians, so you can hear something that these people, who are not set out on some trip to prove any theory, it's an encyclopedia of the ancient world. Brills. They say the Greek term Scythai was an umbrella term including tribes of an originally mostly nomadic way of life who lived in the 7th century until the late antiquity to the north and to the northwest of Pontus, the Black Sea. It is not possible precisely to determine their northern frontiers between the rivers Danube, Dniester, Dnieper, and Don. Does this sound familiar to you? Their neighbors to the east were the Samardians, not Samaritans, Samardians, the Samarte. Those to the southwest, the Thracians. There were also non-Scythian tribes in these regions, and they list them. The Scythians had attempted expeditions to the southeast in the 8th century, mentioned in Assyrian sources from Sargon II, and had settled in the vicinity of Lake Urmia. They posed a constant threat to the kingdom of Urartu. Asarhaddon gave one of his daughters to the Scythian king Barbatua, as recorded by Herodotus, as wife in order to prevent a Scythian coalition with Urartu. And I'm reading back some of the history here so you can really see that's quite staggering, just even in a secular record. No point to prove, to try and talk about the Bible, of course. In 630 or 620 BC, his son, Medes, defeated the Cimeri. We're now back to a different name. Fought against the Mede. Then the Scythian then began a campaign of conquest into Syria and up to the Egyptian border, where Psammetichus, or the Pharaoh, compelled their retreat. Then they returned for 28 years in Asia Minor until the Mede drove them out, which I just referenced to you, and this King Alyattes finally driving them out. Trade between Greek colonies and the Scythians produced via certain emporium or trading posts were common. Both parties also conducted business in the farther hinterland. Greeks bought grain, wool, staple fiber plants, dried fish, precious metals from the Urals and Siberia, and from the 5th century BC, also slaves. The Scythian police force at Athens were also interested in Greek luxury goods. The Greek and Roman image of the Scythian is ambivalent. On the one hand, they saw them as primitive barbarians. On the other hand, as just pious people in close contact with nature. We've got the mention here of Darius and what I've just related to you regarding the monument, the Darius monument. But there's a separation that is mentioned in here regarding the Scythians and the royal Scythians. And we'll encounter those if I do something more in detail, which become, we'll call them a splinter group, which then actually take the royal Scythians, become the group that will be the most warring faction amongst other nations or other peoples. But I just thought I would mention that because I probably will, we will encounter them. How's that? So briefly said, we can know that these people, as they moved, and they did move and migrated. And if you remember, somewhere way back there, it might have been before the flood, I was teaching on the origin of the English language and talked to you about some tribes, some Germanic tribes, which, by the way, the word Germani, don't get confused with modern-day Germany, but Germani was a term that was used to refer to those people who were being referred to as the authentic peoples, tracing back from the Celts, going back to the Cimmerians or the Cimmeroi, as they were labeled that because they were no longer living in a certain area. They became known at one point as the Germani. But these Germanic tribes, namely the Angles, Jutes, and Saxons, that began where we start up with the English language and the formation of the concepts like England, speaking England, we see that these groups of people actually do indeed trace their lineage back. There's no confusion on their part as you can go backwards. So you begin to see these invading tribes that come in, and our language from that point begins to be established. We're talking about the very, very early stages of it. So it's important to follow all this history and to recognize that these people, when we say scattered, God's word says he will scatter the people. We're really talking about something quite incredible. And if I was continuing on the timeline, I told you last week about the death of King Cyrus. He met his death at the hand of Queen Tomyris. Now, there are historians that debate whether or not she actually did the deed, but if you read the record, she actually did the deed because she was getting revenge regarding the death of her son. She was the one that killed Cyrus. She was known as Queen Tomyris, the queen of the Massagetae, which is the same, we're back to the same people. She was the queen of the Sak. And these people eventually, their culture, their kingdoms will eventually disappear, but they will appear elsewhere. Just as we know when we follow the tribe of Dan and the people who arrive on that land, referring to the Tuatha De Danann, those people of the tribe of Dan, we're talking about Ireland, and then you'd have to go into the stories of Jeremiah with Zedekiah's daughters traveling out of Egypt. And again, Herodotus and other sources become invaluable to back up some of these, what were once considered mythical fairy tales of how these people came to be. But the point is that these people that God said would be scattered were indeed scattered. Now, it was said to the prophet Hosea, also that these people in the land where this was said, they'd be known as the sons of the living God. And what I want, at least today, to leave you with is a concept that becomes very clear. There's nowhere that you can look from the land that they began from and that they migrated or they were placed into initially, to all the travels as they moved. And I do not believe that we call people nomads. They pick up and they leave. Did all the people move? I believe that the remnants of the villages and the traces of archaeological finds that were deeply rooted are places where some remained and some stayed. But as they moved and as they migrated, they were fulfilling, without knowing, by the way, generation after generation, they were fulfilling exactly what God said, scattered. In fact, to one of the prophets, he says, to bring you to a new land, which can only be representational, of course, of these that would arrive in the place that I just described as England. Now, if God can be in control of that scattering, and we know my reference to all this somehow was in the book of Revelation, that God will call out of the tribes these people who will be virgins, preachers of righteousness, who will be heralders of the good news. I want you to think of something. The reason why it's important to understand that John, the seer of Revelation, was given this, and it's put down for us to understand. It means that in every corner of the earth, you know, people say, in the end of days, will it just be a small area that will be afflicted? And the answer to that question is, there are things described in a particular part of the earth, and then there are things describing a third part of the earth. So it's going to touch the whole globe. And the most important thing to understand is as God has scattered, as he scattered, the people moved not knowing that they were being scattered or that they were fulfilling a prophecy. But the very way that he scattered the people, he will gather them again. But before that event happens, think of the miracle of this, that in every corner of the earth, there will be someone out of these tribes called out, for whom God only alone will know, not the people that go 2 by 2 in the street, to be the preachers of righteousness and to preach and proclaim the good news in every corner of the earth. Because when you think about the scattering, we're talking as far as Asia, from Asia Minor, clear to the far-flung and furthest places of the earth that you can imagine. So it's important to understand that that reference in Revelation holds a large weight. If you believe that the Bible is true, that God will have people, you know, it'd be really bizarre to have 12,000 virgins from a specific tribe. They're all gathered in one place, but it would not be too difficult if we're talking about a large scattering of people all over the face of the planet. For when God is ready for this time, whenever that time is, and when the events that begin that time, when God is ready, there will be a scattering of these people whom he will call forward to do what they will be called to do for that specific time throughout the whole earth. That's why it's impossible, if you're going to look at this subject, it's impossible to not see God's sovereignty and control. And I don't even have time to get into the rest of the details of what I want to say, and I'm not sure that I'll pick up next week. You'll have to be here to find out. But what I do want to tell you is if God can be in such control, and I just painted a picture which, if you really think about it, is quite staggering. The ability to scatter as far as you can think over the face of the globe these people, and they didn't know they were being scattered in fulfillment of a prophecy. As far as the eye can see, as far as we can look, is the same way that God will call out from every tribe mentioned in the book of Revelation, that 7th chapter, to be those preachers of righteousness, to receive a mark, who will preach to the people where they are, not called out into some forum, but right where they are, which says that God will save people from every corner, from every part of the earth, from those preachers of righteousness. So those people who can respond, which answers the question of those, when we talk about those people who are seen as still on the earth being preached to in that time. The sovereignty of God here is really important, and recognizing if God can do that and keep all these things in balance, and this is happening without these people really understanding completely what is going on, we who are looking at this will say, well, God's doing a really good job at the fulfillment part. We know what happened to these people ultimately, and the birth of our wonderful nation, which, by the way, gets its leg up, its most important leg up from those people fleeing from England, religious persecution, to come to a land where they were free to worship God. And what greater thing could be said than God was still accomplishing his purpose even there. He's not finished. He's not finished in history and prophecy that hasn't yet happened, and he's not finished with you or with me or with this place called Faith Center. So I have a message for you on the sovereignty of God and something for you to take away today. Don't quit. God's not finished with you, with me, or with his plan. That's my message. I'm Pastor Melissa Scott, pastor of Faith Center, Glendale, California. I teach every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. If you'd like to attend services with us, simply call the 800 number, that is 800-338-3030, to join us. If you'd like to watch, listen, and learn 24 hours a day, simply log on to our website at www.pastormelissascott.com.